Hello, good evening, and welcome to the second in a series of events hosted by the National Library of Israel and the Tel Aviv Review of Books. I'm Akin Ajayi, and I'm co-editor of the Tel Aviv Review of Books. Across the 5 Sundays in August, I will be talking with some of Israel's leading translators about their craft and about their relationship with the Hebrew language. Today, I'm absolutely delighted that we're joined virtually by the poet and translator, Linda Zisquit. Linda is the author of several full-length collections of poetry, which include Return from Elsewhere and Havoc, New and Selected Poems. Linda has also translated some of the most unique and original voices in contemporary Hebrew poetry, including Yehuda Amichai, Yona Wallach, Rivka Miriam, and Chedva Harechavim. Linda was born in Buffalo, New York, and made Aliyah to Israel in 1978. For many years, she was a poetry coordinator on the creative writing program at Ilan University. Linda lives and works in Jerusalem, where, incidentally, she also runs Artspace, a home gallery that presents the works of local artists. Linda, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us this evening.
Thank you, Akin. I'm really honored to be in this company. And thank you very much.
Thank you. I was hoping that we could begin by talking about something more contemporary that you've worked on in the recent past. Chedva Harechavim, I think she's considered to be one of Israel's great poets. You've just worked on the translation of her volume, Migol, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about it.
Yes, actually, I translated several of Chedva's poems for international poetry festivals many years ago, but it was only after Migol was published, a friend mentioned something about it that really drew my attention, and I contacted Chedva, and she sent me several poems. Very long, very difficult. The book Migo is actually entirely focused on her son, Elisha, whose nickname was Migo. He died at the age of 28 in 2003. And what's so strong and powerful in this book is her addressing the son, not so much as if he's still alive, but their relationship is still very much alive. And I was actually going to read, I've had incredible, with much gratitude, I must express, I've had enormous luck over the years in various ways, somehow each time, either through the translation or even at the Absorption Center, meeting different poets. And when I was translating Yona Wallach many years ago, I had help of from the very generous Hilit Yeshurun, who's a wonderful literary critic and editor. And now that I've been working on Chedva, and Chedva is a very different kind of poet. With Yona Wallach, I never met Yona Wallach, and we'll talk later, I imagine, about the difficulty of translating her and the pleasure. But Chedva, I would go to her house in Abu Tor. I would often come home feeling like a battered woman because not only did Chedva say she didn't know English, but in fact, often as I would read my translations to her, she would stop me and say no. And she was right. There was a nuance that I hadn't captured.
I see.
And I just wanted to read something that Hilit, the book Migo came out in 2017. She started writing it in 2008.
Right.
And Hilit Yeshurun edited a small volume of selected poems by Chedva. And when that came out in 2018, she wrote, this is a translation, I imagine how Harkavi will be read in the future, how her life from Degania, Bet, to Jerusalem, and to the grave of Elisha will be told. In Chedva Harkavi, in the woman and the poetry, there wells up many elements of that ecstatic material that provokes the imagination. And I was going to read one or two of the excerpts from poems of Chedva, if you would like that.
Absolutely, yes, please.
Yes. Another wonderful friend that I have met through writing is Lilach Lachman, and she also has written and spoken about Chedva's work. And she said the power of Migo is in crossing hidden boundaries between life and death, between mother and son. And it's precisely from this border, from this border collapse, that the difficulty of talking about it is derived. The language of Hedva Harkavi's poems wanders in the forbidden area of speech. And then I quote, like what? And this is from a poem, Till I Hear You Again.
Okay.
Like what? 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 Actually, what? I want to know what? 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 What could possibly be? What? I want to know what? What? In fact, what? 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 What could possibly be? Nothing can be anymore till I hear you again. Call me mother. But there's instead of anguish in many of these poems, there's a surprise, and I'll just read one other small excerpt.
Please.
It's from a series called Something Most Like Happiness. I went crazy over the boy of stunning beauty who made the earth shudder and is silent. I went crazy over the dark whiskers that were piled up like weeds on his cheeks and are silent. I went crazy between the bony fingers of his hands, yellow from so much nicotine, wandering round and round in my hair and are silent. I went crazy in his arms, delighting on my forehead, my eyelids, my cheeks, my neck, my nape, my shoulders, my belly, my hips, my thighs, my knees. I went crazy in the fog at dusk, at the foot of small volcanoes. There we passed an entire morning that will never end, of two lovers wild with pleasure, drawing with colored chalk on white Bristol board the pure beauty of their underworld.
That's a very powerful poem. Thank you very much, Linda. It's a very powerful poem, and something that strikes me actually touches on the place of a poet and the place of a translator. Poetry, to me, I think, gives voice to the subjective, to the internal experience, sometimes to the ineffable. Indeed, it sort of communicates it to the reader. And you approach your reading first as a poet, but then also you're trying to find the voice in one language and transmute it. I use the word transmute deliberately because it seems like magic to me. You transmute it into another language. Could you tell us something about your approach to this wonderful work?
I never meant to translate, as I never meant to have an art gallery. Things have happened with wonder in many ways. And in the beginning, when we first came to Israel and I really didn't know Hebrew,
yes,
I was accompanied, as you know, by two letters from the wonderful poet Robert Creeley, introducing me to Yehuda Amichai and to Shirley Kaufman, who was an American poet who lived in Israel. And their response, Shirley at first, her response was immediate, telling me what to pack and what I would need here, but also inviting me to a translator's party, which actually occurred the day after we arrived at the absorption center. And it was a party honoring Gabriel Prial, a Hebrew writing poet who lived in New York. At the party, I met Gabriel Levin and Zali Gurevich, who became, in many ways, my Israeli brothers and have remained so. And I think it was at that party or at some time afterwards, they because they were both editing together an American journal, the Literary Review, a special issue of Israeli writing.
Yes.
They asked if I would translate 2 poems of Yona Volach. I knew of her reputation as an innovative, difficult, controversial, experimental poet. I said, it'll probably take me a year or 2. I have to enroll in Ulpan, which I then did.
Yes.
And in fact, I spent many, many years slowly, never really focusing on the fact that there would be a collection or a book, although another wonderful opportunity occurred as the result of the letter that Yuda Amichai received, because a number of years later, after I had worked with him on a small collection of desert poems, we would meet at a small cafe on Emek Rifaim. He called me and said, could you come over? There's someone who would like to meet you. And I said, of course, I can leave. And I walked over to Yamin Moshe, and there was a very overpowering figure named Stanley Moss, who was the publisher and is the publisher of a small, wonderful, prestigious poetry press called Sheep Meadow Press, to whom I had sent my first manuscript and it had been rejected. But I had also sent him my second manuscript, Unopened Letters. And Yehuda must have, I didn't realize they were friends. And I didn't know who I was about to meet. But I walk in and there is Stanley Moss, and Yehuda introduces me to him. And Stanley says, I would like to publish both of your books, both Unopened Letters and a collection of Yona Volach. And I guess what really interested him, because Yona Volach's reputation was of someone who challenged so many of things that were taboo in linguistically and socially. And I know Stanley is moved by challenge and poetry that is intense. And ultimately he published both of those books. So those 2 letters really did take me into the translation. I don't know that I answered your question. You asked me what moves me. I don't know that I would have felt an affinity to Yona Volach had there not been this magical kind of circuitous connection through Gabi and Zali and Stanley and Yehuda. And yet, as different as we are in our writing, Yona Volach, I never met her. She died in 1981 or 1985.
85, yes.
At the age of 41. I never met her. There's something I felt that I was inside. I was learning. I was attracted to the challenge, and I guess that's my answer to that project.
Yes.
At the same party, I think it was Gabrielle Levin who.
The great party, I have to say.
Excuse me? I
said it must have been a great party.
You know, it was funny because I really wasn't talking to my husband because I didn't want to be in Israel, and we had 2 little children at the time. But it was an amazing party because ultimately we ended up talking to each other, and I did meet my Israeli brothers, and so many things occurred after that. And thanks to Shirley Kaufman, I was there.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, just to give a bit of a backstory, because we've actually talked about this at length. So as you said, you made that there in 1978, and you were quite conflicted in the sense that you were leaving your family in the United States. You didn't have any Hebrew at all, and the Israel of 1978 is pretty far removed from the Israel of 2021, I think it's fair to say. And it seems to me that these letters created an opening for you into a world that you felt you could belong in, a world of poetry, and also a world of engaging with a new language. Yehuda Amichai, who I believe was, his poems were the first series of poems that you translated for publication. Again, another one of Israel's great poets. I think he was one of the first Israeli poets to use colloquial or everyday Hebrew in his work. Did that in any way influence you or encourage you in terms of its presenting a more accessible starting point to engage with language?
I think that poetry that is accessible, even if it touches the most personal and complex issues, if it's accessible, then someone can read it and experience it. My own poetry is powered by longing, by loss, often by struggle. And I loved Yuda Amichai's poetry, and I also loved Dalia Rabikovich's poetry. I read it only at the time in English. It's funny, though, you say my first translated poems were Yuda Amichai. In fact, a very funny story. I don't know if this even is of interest, but at the Opan, where I enrolled in order to be able to translate Yona Volach and to be able to speak Hebrew, I looked around the class and I thought the person that looked most interesting was a man named Yitzchak. And Yitzchak was from Russia. And his Hebrew was as good as my Hebrew. But he said to me, he had a friend, Ilya Rubin, who had been a prisoner of Zion, who didn't survive, but had published a book of poetry, and could I please translate some of them? I didn't know Russian. Neither of us knew Hebrew, but somehow with our broken Hebrew, together, I translated 4 of Ilya Rubin's extraordinary poems. And then I had the great pleasure of meeting Ilya Rubin's widow. And she came and she said, these were wonderful. So there was this very strange kind of beginning. And, you know, being in the absorption center, one does have a sense of both distance from what is going on in the city where we were. It was in Gilo. But translation also has a way of bringing one closer and helping to form some even intimate connections. You know, now that Chedva and I have gone through many, many, many months of working together, and with Helit Yeshurun's wonderful assurance often, the difficulty has become an extreme fondness and pleasure. And I think I have a quote actually of Wallace Stevens about poetry being, if I can find it.
Well, the Stevens, of course, will be great editor and writer himself.
Yes, he wrote a letter to a friend to whom he had dedicated a poem, and he said, the essence of poetry is change, and the essence of change is that it gives pleasure. So pleasure, change, challenge, I mean, all of this for me has been so much a part of the translating and my writing life.
Indeed. At this party, I think it's fair to describe it as that legendary party way back in 1978. Yes. You also made the acquaintance of another poet. Could you tell us a little bit about her and your work with her over the years?
At the same party, it was Gabrielle who said, there's a young poet who lives in the German colony, Rivka Miriam. And I think you might enjoy meeting her. As I said, I never met Yona Volach, but I did meet Rivka. She, in fact, lives a few blocks away. And we would meet. And over the course of a number of years, by reading together, my Hebrew improved. And I translated many of her poems. Rivka, her background is one of Holocaust survivors, her parents, who believed that the world had been born anew by their coming to Israel. And so much of her work is connected to her ancestors, who she feels are very much alive in her. So much of her poetry had this biblical connection, which also spoke to me. That's another aspect of my own work, which has been a lot of it because I've studied with a wonderful teacher who became a very dear friend of Eva Zornberg. A lot of my poems are fragments that are embedded in my Parashat HaShavua notebooks. And my connection to Rivka was probably, the attraction was probably somewhat related to that. I mean, I have a poem of hers, if you would like, that I could read. Would you like?
Yes, please.
There was a period, I mean, it's interesting also it's not as if I chose to translate. I think it chose me almost, certainly with Yona Volach. And I was taken in almost into a whirlwind with her brilliance and her experimenting with the language. And with Rivka, also there was something about being chosen, but at a certain point, I think my translation periods were because I wasn't able to do any of my own writing. It was during periods of being stuck on some level.
Okay.
So there was a year when both Chaim Gori, Rivka Miriam, Shirley Kaufman, and Gabi Levin all had new books coming out. So I spent that year interviewing my friends. And this poem of Rivka's, I remember asking her about it. I'll read it. It's called Happy Are They. Happy are they who mate with their parents underground, at the crossroads, at the opening of eyes, and they're short-sighted with a blurry vision. Only their nape is strong and sensitive, antennae in their backs. They couple with their parents backwards, back and forth, again and again, like Ham and Noah, like his daughters with Lot, to seed themselves anew or block their own births, sticking end to beginning. And they're a bullet of fire till rest is found, till movement cease, until and nevermore. And when I asked her about it, she said it was very much the case that after the Holocaust, there was no past, that they had to create a past the way Lot's daughters had to create, to move on. There was something very, very strange and curious about it, and not at all my experience, but somehow extremely moving. That idea that what she was doing was creating both a future and a past through her poetry.
It's very interesting to see that, because it seems to me that Rivka Miriam's poetry is very much engaged with the notion of continuity, of drawing from the past and envisaging in the future. Yona Wallach, who we've mentioned at length, what we should introduce a little bit more formally now for the benefit of those in the audience who may not be familiar with her work. Yona today would be considered, if she were writing today, would be considered part of the zeitgeist, I imagine. But in the 1970s and 1980s, before her death, she was an innovative, at times indeed a transgressive poet. She played with the language and she played with preconceptions about ourselves and about our state of being. She was accused of blasphemy indeed with one of her more famous or notorious poems.
Yes.
And yet I'm interested that as a reader and indeed as a translator, both Rivka Miriam and Yona Wallach in different ways spoke to you. Could you give me a sense of you as a reader and what it meant to you to engage with these poems at this point in time, and how in different ways they engaged you and, as it seems, invigorated you as a reader, as a writer, as a translator?
I think both of them have an intensity and a necessity in their work that speaks to me. I think, though many people reading Yona Volach, reading that poem, that controversial or notorious poem,
yes,
infamous poem, Tefillin, I think so many in the poem, in which, if people don't know it, is where she takes the straps of the Tefillin and she uses them in a sexual way and almost in a violent way. But it's from a series of poems where she begins, when you come to me, come like my father, come like God, come like a judge. And in each case, she is experimenting and exploring relationships, in a sense, with authority figures or relationships where there was a hierarchy. And it seems to me that, and also a very famous poem called Hebrew, Ivrit, which I could read a little bit of it, where she is cross-dressing and transgendering and with the language. it seems to me so much of her work is involved with finding a good way to relate men and women, each other, women and women, men and men, something that isn't hierarchical, but rather equal. And when she says Hebrew is a sex maniac in the poem that I'll read a small piece of it, she is clearly understanding that, this is a very gender conscious language. And at first she is resisting it. She's complaining about it, but she ultimately comes to some kind of it's almost a love poem to the language. And what's very interesting, towards the end of her life, whereas many of the early poems are basically, she speaks through personae who are persecuted children, they're ill, there's a lot of illness. At the end of her life, when she actually is ill with breast cancer, she is, it seems, wanting some connection, some communion with the divine, with God. And in a way that it is similar to Rivka Miriam. And at a certain point, I thought that Rivka is the traditional poet and Yona is the controversial, innovative poet. But in fact, there is a place, and I feel very much connected to that, of seeking some kind of sense of the divine, of communion. And shall I read the Hebrew poem, a piece of it?
Yes.
And then one poem, I actually have another friend who I wanted to mention, and that's my friend Sidra Ezrahi, who often reads my work and in her insightful and brilliant way often tells me what I'm doing in my work. But also, so I mean, it's very, very helpful. And she wrote a beautiful review of the first collection that was called Wild Light, which came out at the same time as Unopened Letters. So I actually learned from Sidra's review something about what I was doing. Anyway,
your first collection of poetry, I believe.
Excuse me?
Unopened Letters is your first collection of poetry.
No, my first collection was called Ritual Bath. And Robert Creeley, way back when I was in 7th grade in Buffalo, I was in a class where we read Hart Crane and Thomas Wolfe and Robert Creeley, and I fell in love with his poetry and kind of followed him, reading his work, and then had the great luck as an adult, when we lived back in Buffalo for 5 years actually, of meeting him, and he became an abiding friend, and he actually facilitated the publication of my first book. He sent it to a press and it was accepted. And then he actually set up my first reading as a published poet together with him. And the entire audience, I'm sure, had come to hear Creeley, but they had to listen to me.
I had to listen to you as well. But yes, please,
Okay, so Hebrew, I'll read up to a small, it's a very long poem, but just to give you an idea.
Yes.
She's playing with gender, and you know that ata and we can only say you and you in English. So I had to find a solution. So my solution was to put feminine and masculine in parentheses, and I'll read it that way.
Okay.
Hebrew. English has all the possibilities for gender. Every I, in effect, is every possibility of sex. And every you, feminine, is you, masculine. And every I is sexless. And there's no difference between you, feminine, and you, masculine, and all things are it. Not a man, not a woman. You don't have to think before referring to sex. Hebrew is a sex maniac. Hebrew discriminates against or in favor, doesn't hold a grudge, grants privileges with an account longer than the exile. In the plural, the he's have priority with great subtlety and secrecy. In the singular, opportunities are equal. Who says all hope is lost? Hebrew is a sexmaniac. She wants to know who's speaking. Almost a vision, almost a picture. What's forbidden in the whole Torah, or at least to see the sex, Hebrew peeks through the keyhole. I'll stop there, but it gives you an idea, I think. And there's one later poem of hers that I think I've missed the place. Her later poems had a kind of quietness to them, an awareness of the end, an awareness also of, she spoke in a wonderful interview with Hilit Yeshurun that she was always afraid and she was always putting up all kinds of presentations.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a poem that's called, I No Longer Really Love Being Afraid. I would play with fear as with a child, wave it in front of me, look at its face and call it fear, fear, come. I would read the most frightening things. I would become addicted to the sensations as if that were the only thing still me, the fear. Small fears didn't interest me, only the large fear, sweeping everything away. Now, I no longer really love being afraid. I found myself sitting and calling it again, whispering, as it was then in those days, fear, fear, come play fear with me. I thought that was what I had to do then in those days, being afraid. I'd freeze from fear, see terrible things, also hear. One day it began, I discovered the fear, I discovered other things, madness, for example. But that's in another place, in a similar form. I discovered the human perceptions, I found interpretation shock later, different things I understood and other things I became fed up with. But the fear was last. I walked long corridors, always long corridors of monasteries, hospitals, public buildings. And I said to me that from the start, the fear and the madness, I'm leaving, I'm fed up. Again, I no longer really love being afraid. Now is the time for reaping. I'm gathering the fruits of fear, mostly rotten, looking at them with a smile, not horror, and rejecting them from my sight. Again, I no longer love being afraid.
Well, the context for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with Yonah Wallach's life, that she died tragically young at the age of, I think, 41
Yes.
in 1985 from breast cancer. I think today we have the language and at least some awareness to appreciate the notion that men and women have different experiences of life. And certainly when Yonah Wallach was writing in the 1970s, 1980s, that would have been less the case. But what I wanted to ask is, I don't want to ask if you consider yourself a feminist poet or indeed a feminist translator. I'm not quite sure if such a thing exists. But I wanted to ask if you consider yourself a feminist reader and what that means in terms of engaging with poetry.
I don't know what that means. Actually, I mean, the poets that I've translated over the last many, many years, other than that small book of Yehuda Amichai, have all been women.
Yeah.
And I realized that. And in each case, it was a poet towards whom there was some affinity, attraction. I remember reading in one of Yonah Wallach's, in an excerpt from an interview, where she complained that Dalia Rabikovich wasn't feminist enough. And yet I was surprised because she also rejected the term feminist.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to be a feminist poet? I speak from the place of my life. I speak from the place of crisis or mistakes or love and longing and the richness of my life and mistakes or hurts and is that feminist because I'm a woman? And I seek freedom in my work. I think I've been reading wonderful, wonderful a wonderful book called Self-Portrait by Celia Paul and a number of articles. She's an English painter.
Yes.
And she was in a long-term relationship with Lucian Freud. And it took her many, many years, even though she was painting all those years, to somehow feel that she doesn't like that term, that in her own right, she was an artist, not just having been Lucian Freud's lover. Same thing with Gwen John, same thing with Charlotte Bronte, each of them having a relationship of some longing, and yet the determination to do their own work, to find an interior space that from which they could speak. Is that feminist? You know, I'm not sure.
Well, I'm not sure either. I'm not sure I'm the person to be sure about what it is to be feminist, to be honest. But I've always thought that the capacity to speak honestly about one's life, about one's mistakes, about one's triumphs and one's misses is possibly a feminist act in itself.
I think the best poetry explores what needs to be understood of the self by the person writing, man, woman. So, you know, is it that women are braver, so they're doing it without masks? Perhaps this is a time when maybe more women are being. It was interesting when I started writing. It never occurred to me that there were limitations, except I mean, I know there are, and I know that I censor, and I always have, and I have a large family, and I have wonderful children, and I have what my friend Sidra calls a very capacious husband who both enables that kind of interior space. He's also, I should mention, been my guide through every first draft of translation that I've done, because his Hebrew is much better than mine. But in any event, an awareness of others does create some sense of limitation, but when one is writing a poem, there is absolutely no boundary other than form. Form is a wonderful way of controlling chaos, but not controlling truth or honesty.
Right. How does the experience of translating a poem or translating the work of a poet differ from that of having your own work translated?
Well, first of all, I've really found great pleasure and joy. I've so much enjoyed the translating that I've done. I've had some of my poems translated by friends. Rivka Miriam did a few. Yossi Sharon did a few. Another poet asked me if she could translate some poems many, many years ago.
Yes.
And I was very busy in my personal life teaching children. And when she presented me with her finished project, and I sat with her, one poem in particular, I said, there are some mistakes here that we need to correct. My Hebrew probably wasn't good enough to correct all of the grammatical, solutions that she had found. It's a poem that, if you'd like, I can read it, but it's called The Peony and the Ant. I've spoken of this before because it's a funny situation. At the time, which is probably now about 20 years ago, peonies weren't very popular in Israel. You didn't find them at the florist the way now you can, or in gardens. But it was a poem that I had actually written before we came to Israel, and it's a love poem. And it uses the image of the peony when it's still a bud, and ants are crawling all over it because there's a sticky film that covers the bud. And gardeners, apparently, I've read also that it may not be true, but it's not a myth. I think it's a belief that one needs the ants in order for the flower to open.
Awesome. Right.
To blossom. And that was the central image of my poem, called The Peony and the Ant. Yes. And this poet, who I respect very much, said we can't use the word, we can't have peony because Israelis don't know that flower. I said, but it's the image for the poem. She said she wanted nurit, which is a buttercup or ranunculus, but it's a common flower and it doesn't have that characteristic. So I said, no. And she said, but I won't use peony. And I said, but then you can't publish the poem. So that was the end of that. That was one small little vignette. I've never really pursued having my poetry translated.
Why not?
I don't know. I guess I lacked a certain sense that it was necessary. You know, it's written in English. It's my native language. It works in English. I think it had something to do with shyness also, and keeping. I mean, I'm peripheral in many ways because I still speak English and I write in English, and I still teach for many, many years in English, and translating is a way of meeting and coming close to Israeli poets and to the landscape. But I'm still peripheral. I'm still an outsider, and somehow I didn't pursue that bridge.
I see. You were going to read The Peony and the Ants.
You want me to read it?
Yes, please. It's an interesting poem, and I think it would be interesting to understand why the buttercup couldn't have worked in this context.
Okay. The Peony and the Ant. Each morning this June, I wake in the pit of my belly. Goldenrod, fuchsia, peonies tightly fragrant on the inside of my flesh. How to open the fist of petal. Speak with a man I never lay with, never tasting his long, lengthwise odor, undoing his skin like the ant for the brightness beneath. Out of these June bugs and undersounds, I wake early before the children. I hear the grass grow straight, earth breaking into curled, hard to bear, reticent, crimson flowers.
Thank you. Sorry, just take my out of my mouth. Thank you very much.
Yes.
About translations, I mean, in reading and thus in translating a poem, there are many different approaches. You could imitate the prosody, the rhythm of the original. You could try to reproduce it. You could reinterpret it moderately or radically. You could reconstitute it. What informs the approach you take to translating a poem?
I love what Robert Lowell wrote about imitation, because he said he took as much freedom translating as the authors did writing their poems. Now, I have probably also, having the guidance of my husband, Donald, with literal translations,
yes,
tried to follow, but it's really tone that could be lost if one doesn't somehow enter the poem and make it one's own, which I think I've done in many of these cases. Mm-hmm. The times when, in Yona Volach's case especially, where she was using the language in such a way that there was no way that I could capture that complexity in English, I didn't translate the poem. And with Hedva, I've been drawn into this extraordinary, her addressing a son, her ability to live in a living relationship with a son who's no longer there.
Yes.
I'm just taken in. So I follow her lead. I'm led by her poetry in a way.
I see.
I don't think I could I've been asked to translate poems here and there for various, I guess, poetry conferences and things, but these poets that I've spent a lot of time on, I don't think I could have done it if I didn't feel some natural affinity. And it's not really imitation in my case. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's reconstituting. A friend recently said that translation is can be a form of radical interpretation. Do I interpret these poems? I imagine somebody else translating them would use different language, but I use my language, and I think that's the reconstituting. It's like reconstituting a self when one writes a poem. It's always, writing a poem is already one step from the I.
Translation of sorts, isn't it? Even writing a poem.
Yes, yes. And there's a certain, translating is carrying over. It's carrying into another language. It's transporting. And I think I do that in my daily life, in my own poetry. It's a kind of translating of an inner consciousness crisis and also, richness.
I see. Just to remind the audience that we will have the opportunity for a few questions at the end of our conversation. So if you've got any questions or comments that you'd like to put to Linda, please feel free to slot them in the chat facility at the bottom of the page. Linda, you taught poetry and creative writing for many years at Ilan University. What sort of effects does teaching have, or did teaching have, on your own work, either as a translator or as a writer, as a poet yourself?
First of all, I learned a great deal from my students. There was only 1 year that I taught a translation course, and there I was learning along with them. A few brilliant translators came out of that class. But often, the same way that my Parashat HaShavua notebooks are embedded with fragments of poems, my teaching notebooks, I would always do the exercises that I gave the students. For example, we spoke about the Ghazal form, which was an ancient Urdu, Persian, Arabic form, generally a love poem, often a love poem to God, very strict form. And I knew about it, but I had never used it and had never really studied it. And a brilliant student 1 year brought his translation of ancient Persian Ghazal, and I was taken by it, and we analyzed it and figured out exactly what the form is. It's made up of couplets, and the words that the first couplet rhymes, it repeats itself at the end of each next couplet. And at the end, there's a kind of statement where the poet either berates him or herself or commends him or herself. And I got hooked on it. And I ended up writing, I think, 1.5 years, almost every day, another Ghazal. So that, and they're very for me, it was as much as the form was strict, it was a release. It was very liberating, and I could be very playful with it, even with subjects that had been so deep and dark or complex before. Suddenly they were, because you're using a word again and again, but differently. There's play. So that was.
There's also form, which seems to be, as you mentioned before, form allows all kinds of possibilities.
Yes.
Indeed. Your most recent published work is the chapbook from the Notebooks of Korah's Daughter. And indeed, that comes back to the notion of form again.
Yes.
It is, and I'll read from the introduction to the chapbook, that it's inhabiting a landscape that is at once biblical and contemporary. The speaker of this ecstatic sequence is the imagined daughter of Korah, who rebelled against Moses and Aaron, and whom, together with his sons and followers, was swallowed up by the earth. According to legend, Korah's sons repented and became psalmists, singers of the highest rung of the underworld. However, no daughter of Korah appears in the traditional sources. So that's a starting point for this series of poems, each one derived from a particular psalm. Could you tell us a little bit more about the writing and the influences beyond the traditional sources that informed this selection of poems?
This series is different from anything I had ever written. it started when one of our daughters was diagnosed with cancer in 2014. And at a certain point, there was a sense that things were worse than it turned out that they were, and she has recovered, thankfully. But at the time, I actually turned to the Psalms. I actually turned to Aviv Zornberg, who sent me a wonderful modern translation of the Psalm, of one Psalm. I had had the deaths of my parents. I had experienced that, but somehow hadn't seriously read the Psalms. And I needed somehow to feel that I was helping our daughter. And I took Psalm number 1, and in English, a line that struck me. And I used that line to free associate.
Mm-hmm.
Someone had given me a large, beautiful notebook. I remember at the time thinking, when will I ever write such long poems? But somehow that enabled, and I enabled the length. And I did 150 every single day. I took a line from the next psalm, and then the next psalm, free associating to them. And then I realized they were very personal.
Mm-hmm.
There are other threads from my life that enter into these poems. But because there was something so personal, I needed a distance, and I needed to find a voice through which to speak. And because also from the Parashat HaShavua classes with Aviva Zornberg, I had learned about Korach's issue of language and his lack of doubt and his inability to enter into an argument with Moses. And then this chasm opens up. And somehow thinking of the daughter of Korach as an agent of speech for me enabled me to kind of place her as the voice in those poems, and made small alterations of nature and society so that it felt almost, it was both contemporary and had an element of the biblical. So she became my agent of speech.
Wow, amazing. I'm delighted to hear your daughter made a full recovery.
Thank you.
I'm mindful of the fact that we've been chatting for a better part of an hour, and I believe there are a few questions in the chat facility. But before I turn it over to Doron, who's going to help us out with that, I wondered if you might be able to read from the notebooks of Korah's daughter.
I'll read the first one.
Thank you very much.
It begins like a tree. It's really interesting. A friend of mine, I also have wonderful friends that I correspond with, poets abroad. One is Nina Bogan in France, and another is Jenny Barber in America. And Jenny recently said that she was editing a book on an anthology with some other people on trees. And I realized how many trees appear in this collection. This isn't the poem she selected, but it begins with a line, like a tree planted by rivers of water, from Psalm number 1. Mm-hmm. Not to think moving to another room will open the pores or seal the sorrow. It seeps in because you are the keeper who lets it in. No door wide open or shut would have let this happen. Clear from the start, a tree yielding its fruit in season. At the bottom of steps, a garden grows. I could go outside and drink in the green. For now, I must keep myself fixed to this chair, this text, this fleeting existence. Was it yesterday I thought they dug deep, cut the hole clean to the root, not a cell left to fester or seek an unseen crack, then closed the wound to heal, nothing withered? By chance today, I draw an image of before, the hair, the mouth, the brow, a girl emerging from the stream, urgent yet uncertain, her fullness smiling out at me.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. This series, they've been changed. I actually realized while I was reading it that I've cut some of the words from it, but I read the way it appears in the chapbook. But that will be the central section of a new collection that I've just finished.
I look forward to reading it in the fullness of time.
Thank you.
Linda, Thank you ever so much for your full and generous answers to my perhaps slightly informed questions.
You've been wonderful. Thank you.
You're very kind. We still have a little bit of time, so if I could ask Doron if he could kindly take over at this point and perhaps read to Linda and myself a few questions from the audience. That'll be very kind.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you very much, Akin. There are many, many compliments in the chat room, and I'll send you the transcripts so you can read them yourself. There are also many questions, and I'll try to read as many of them as possible. For those I won't read, I apologize in advance. The first question is technical, and it says, it usually takes about 1.5 words in English for every word in Hebrew. How do you manage to express ideas and nuances in poetry without making the translation long and difficult to read or understand?
I don't know how to answer that exactly. I guess I always seek the more concise and economical, but if I have to leave some, there are times when one drops and loses in translation. I mean, that we know. I think sometimes what we gain is maybe a longer poem, a discovery. Otherwise, we're using English and taking the Hebrew, which is more economical. So it's part of the process to find a solution that isn't too long, I suppose.
Thank you very much. Sidra asked, can you relate your translations to your own poetry?
Again?
Can you relate your translations to your own poetry? Is there any kind of correlation or inspiration or?
Well, how have I been affected by it? Maybe I think in some ways with Yona Volach, I remember using an image and I thought, where did that come from? And I realized it was from when she lived in the Dormition Abbey and I had a dome suddenly in a poem, and I thought that was coming from Yona. And more recently with Chedva, I've written some long poems, and that may be a connection. Two other poets that I've translated recently are Nadia Adina Rose and Susan Afterman, and I admire them both enormously. And Susan writes her ability to capture place and time and a certain moment is something I admire, and I have tried to learn from her. And with Nadia Dina Rose, originally from Moscow, writes almost haiku, and though a lot of her work is fundamentally coming from a place of loss, her sister was killed in a bus bombing, and her first book, Snow Ink, is dedicated to her sister. Her work is so full of light, and I look for that also. So I guess I've been somewhat influenced in terms of admiring and seeking to learn.
Thank you very much. LSM wrote, following Sidra's question, do you have an idea of an ideal reader of your translations? If yes, does that reader differ from an ideal reader of your own poems?
Whoa, I once gave a poetry reading in America. In America, when I would give poetry readings, it was always audiences that didn't know me at all, generally, as opposed to here. Somehow here, if my kids are there or my husband or friends, there's a certain fear of exposure. And in America, I remember once reading, and a man came up to me and said, those were the scariest poems I've ever heard. And I thought, oh my goodness, I have that effect. So I thought, that was interesting. I don't know that he would be my perfect reader, but no, I don't have an idea for a perfect reader. I would hope that they would move whoever reads them.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Jay asks, can you translate poetry without being a poet?
That's a question Donald asked me yesterday. And I thought, don't ask me that question. That isn't anything I was prepared to think about. But I think all of the poetry in translation that I've read and loved has been translated by poets. I think there's a sense that even if they don't even know the language they're translating from, which was often the case. Also, Shirley Kaufman, she would have somebody guide her through the Hebrew. I read recently another introduction to a book where one of the translators didn't know Greek but felt so connected and was able to translate it. But I don't know that there's a rule, but something about tone and heart and form and music, I think, comes from a poet.
Thank you very much. As I said, there are many compliments in the chat room. I just want to read one of them. Sue wrote, "So wonderful. Thank you for this rich program. Linda is always brilliant and so gracious. It is a privilege to share this precious and fertile hour. I hope that many others will have access to this recording. Thank you." For the question, Sarah asked, how difficult is it to keep your own emotions out of the translation?
Oh, impossible. I don't. When I mentioned difficult combative connection to Chedva, it was really because we were trying to get the right word and I was trying to understand, but keeping my emotions out when the poetry is so deeply connected to an emotional landscape, no, I don't keep it out. I wouldn't.
Thank you. Monica asks, is the Psalm series going to be in the new collection?
Yes, hopefully there will be there is a new collection. Hopefully it will be published. And it is it's the middle section of the new collection. Yes.
Thank you very much. Simeon asked, what was the biggest constraint you encountered translating poetry?
I think it was in terms of the gender consciousness in Yona Volach's poetry, finding solutions, because there were poems where the pronoun was feminine and the verb would be masculine, and I realized she was moving and how to capture that. There was a lot, and I was learning Hebrew, and from one of the most difficult poets, actually. I think that that's probably it.
Thank you very much. So in our previous session, the translator said that sometimes it's possible to translate prose without reading the work in entirety prior to translation. This is probably not possible in poetry, but how many times would you say you have to read the poem before being able to translate it?
Many, many times. In Chedva's case, in each case, I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know it was going to take me 18 years of being inside of Yona Volach's head and continuing, and then another few years after that, correcting many of my mistakes in the previous collection when it came out, the second collection. Now I'm forgetting what the question was. How many times do I have to read the poem? It's good Donald's here. Many times, many times.
Thank you very much. I think we're down to the last question. I apologize to those I've skipped over. Following the last question, I will open the microphones for people so that they can ask further questions that they haven't written in the chat room. But the last question is by Tamar, admitting that there hasn't been real or serious motivation to be translated into Hebrew. What is the motivation to translate Hebrew poetry into English? Why translate these poems and for whom?
It's a very good question. And it's interesting. One comes to this country where Hebrew is one of the two main languages that are spoken here, Hebrew and Arabic. And one is an English speaker. And there is a need to to get closer to the language, to the literature, to be a part of the place. And literature is always where the pulse is. And I found that often the sensibility of the poet often taught me something about myself. And it was crucial. I think it's part of a poet's work, living here, to also be translating.
Thank you very much, Linda. And before Doron opens the microphones for final comments, first of all, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for being with us this evening and for your insightful and intuitive questions. I would like to thank, as ever, Olga Lempert and Doron Levin for their administrative, technical, and all kinds of support, without which this wouldn't have happened. And most of all, I'd like to thank Linda for her generosity with her time, for her insightful answers. And I'm not sure she remembers this. A very long time ago, I interviewed her for the Jerusalem Post. And at the time, I freely admit, a complete Philistine, and I didn't read poetry at all. And she was so generous and so patient and so warm in talking about her work that she opened up an entirely new world for me. And I will always remain grateful for that. Linda, thank you very much for the evening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Akin. What a lovely compliment you just paid me. And Doron, thank you. You were great calming me down. I had a lot of problems before with the computer. Akin, your questions were great. Thank you.
Very kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you both again, Linda and Akin. Thank you so much. Thank you all once more. Thank you everyone for being here from all over the world. Wonderful representation of so many countries. Wonderful to see everybody here. I'm going to open the microphones. Laila Tov from Jerusalem. Thank you again.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Thank you so much, Linda, from New Hampshire.
Oh, Sidra, hi. Thank you.
Well, proud of you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Spellbinding, excellent. What a presence, and what a, where's...
I'm trying to get him over here, come on. And there's Kenny and Antoinette were here too.
Real muse, out of boy. Limping.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
God bless.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Linda, bye-bye. I'll talk to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Linda. That was really wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Now I can have a glass of wine.
Yes, Jen, you deserve it. We'll all join you.
Good. Thank you very much. Akin, thank you.
Linda, thank you ever so much, really.
Okay.
Great job, Linda.
Thank you.
And so I think we can say goodbye to everyone now. Goodbye,
Yes.
and thank you for joining us.
Laila Tov. Bye-bye.